In this lesson, we're going to take a step away from the fighting of Vietnam and look at the arms race itself and how the Cold War eventually comes to a conclusion. A nuclear arms race develops between the United States and the Soviet Union, as can be seen by the chart here, indicating over the various years from 1945 through 2010 the numbers of nuclear warheads that each side had. You can see the height of the U.S. Is in the mid-60s, and we're looking at about 32,000 warheads. The height in the Soviet Union is closer to the 1990. We're looking at about 45,000 warheads. So there is a massive arms race where each nation had the ability to destroy each other, destroy the entire planet many times over. Before we continue with that line of thought, I just need to take a sidestep for a moment and note the fact that when Eisenhower was president during the 1950s, he issued the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is essentially an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. The Middle Eastern countries had become independent countries at this point, and the concern, particularly with all of the oil in that region, was communist aggression in that area, and somehow we would be cut off from our supply of oil. So Eisenhower issues the doctrine that says what you see here, that we will use any force, use force to safeguard the independence of any Middle Eastern nation against communist-inspired aggression. All right, here we see Ike with the Shah of Iran, and we had a very close relationship with Iran while the Shah was in power there. When Nixon was president, he attempted to try and ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and this policy was known as détente, which is essentially French for easing of tensions. Nixon was actually the first president to visit China. All right, we see him here with Chairman Mao on the left, and on the right with his wife Pat Nixon visiting the Great Wall. All right, and this was a country that we had no relationship with, so he actually starts a relationship with them. Maybe you remember the movie from Forrest Gump, where Forrest goes to China to play ping pong. And yes, that actually took place. The United States ping pong team played the Chinese ping pong team as a way to sort of break the ice and start a relationship. Here we're looking at pictures of, on top, Nixon visiting the Soviet Union, and he's shaking the hands of the leader at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, who responds with a visit to Washington. So it was successful, albeit temporary, easing of tensions between us and the communist nation. This item probably belongs better in the lesson on the Vietnam War. If you saw that lesson, you'll remember that Nixon extended the war from Vietnam into Cambodia to go after the North Vietnamese army. Congress was not happy with many of the actions President Johnson took and the actions that President Nixon took, because both presidents kind of used the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as carte blanche to do what they wanted in regard to Vietnam and fighting there. All right, so you see here, I'll make this a little bit larger. The 1973 War Powers Act limited the president's ability to send troops overseas without congressional approval. All right, I'm not aware that the constitutionality of this provision has been tested, because the Constitution indicates that the president's commander-in-chief, which gives him the ability to move troops around. Having said that, presidents since the passage of the War Powers Act have asked for and received congressional approval. So again, I'm not aware that this has been tested in the courts yet. I'm going to skip Presidents Ford and Carter, meaning I'm skipping basically the 1970s and the Cold War. At that point, there were a couple of treaties that were negotiated between us and the Soviet Union during that time, meaning arms reduction treaties. But really we need to focus on how the Cold War comes to a conclusion. And in order to do that, we have to talk about President Reagan, who took the opposite tack from President Carter right before him, and chose to build up our military and our nuclear missile capability. All right, so there was a tremendous amount of spending to develop this capability because Reagan asserted that in order for us to negotiate with the Soviets effectively, we needed to do so from a position of strength, all right, not a position of weakness, as a reference to the fact that President Carter had really begun to significantly defund the military. Reagan shared with the American people something called the Strategic Defense Initiative back in 1983, when he envisioned, and this was a vision, and money was going to be dedicated to researching this vision to have it develop and come true. Let me make this a little bit larger so that we can see. There we go. All right. The idea behind the Strategic Defense Initiative was that we would figure out a way, put satellites up in space with missile capabilities, so that if the Soviets launched missiles from Russia, let's say, all right, we would have the ability, while those missiles were in space, traveling to hit the United States, to strike at those missiles and blow them up essentially harmlessly out in space. All right, that was the logic behind the Strategic Defense Initiative. It does not yet exist, although the military does use technology from this research. All right, the media at the time laughed at the president for this and dubbed the program Star Wars after the movie Star Wars, and mocked it. However, the Soviets were actually quite upset, and indicated to President Reagan frequently that they wished us to stop research into this program. So it had an effect of certainly worrying the Soviet Union. President Reagan had no problem antagonizing the Soviet Union verbally. He spoke these peace through strength issues and the SDI. He referred to the Soviet Union frequently in speeches as the evil empire. Really felt that they really had a wrong-headed approach to things. Having said that, he met with the Soviet leader, who at the time was Mikhail Gorbachev, a number of times. You can see here they negotiated successfully the intermediate range nuclear missile treaty, reduction of nuclear missiles, in 1987, and the two of them actually developed a fairly close personal friendship. Ultimately, Mr. Gorbachev is going to have to make some changes, because what was happening in the Soviet Union really was the beginning of the collapse. And what I mean by that, the United States was spending all of this money ramping up its military capabilities. The Soviet Union followed suit. But in the United States, this did not have a significant negative effect on our economy, because we have a free market economy where business is owned by private individuals, and the Soviet Union has a command economy where the government owns everything. So if they're devoting resources to military production, that means they're not devoting resources to other things, in this case, consumer goods. So Gorbachev, you see here two words, glasnost and perestroika. These were two programs Gorbachev put in place, which translate to openness and restructuring. They're essentially small level political reforms in terms of free elections at the local level, and small free market reforms in terms of some low level small business ownership, if you will. We see here from this photo, and I highly recommend you search YouTube for this speech, because it really is quite a moving speech. We see President Reagan in West Berlin, in front of the Brandenburg Gate, So he's inside the Berlin Wall in democratic West Berlin, which is technically a part of West Germany, pushing again, declaring that Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall and the whole. So as the economy of the Soviet Union is beginning to crack, Reagan is continuing to keep the pressure on. Things collapse first, I should say communism collapses first, in the Eastern Bloc countries, the satellite nations. And here we're looking at Poland, where it's the shipyard workers that go on strike because they're upset. If memory serves, they're not getting paid. But the whole country was upset. Ordinary consumers were upset because they were now waiting on lines for basic food items like bread and basic consumer items that they needed. So it became obvious there that the government is no longer in a position to provide these things. So the folks took to the streets, and the Polish government's going to collapse. You can see here Lech Walesa, the head of the Shipyard Workers Union, is going to be elected the first Polish president. All right. Similarly, in Germany, all right. In Berlin, we are looking at shots of the wall. The East German government is going to collapse as people take to the streets, and the most vivid symbol of communism is now being hacked apart. All right, and on the Regents, if often they will ask the question of the event that shows the beginning of the collapse of communism or the end of the Cold War, and that is the Berlin Wall coming down. I should point out that President Reagan was no longer president in 1989. There was an election in 1988, and George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, who was Reagan's vice president, was actually the president at the time of the collapse of communism. Right? He was in power. He was in power from 1989 until 1992, January of 1992. He was a one-term president. The Soviet Union collapses slightly later. It took about another year and a half plus. All right, but here we're looking at pictures of the Kremlin building, and that's the communist leadership was inside that building, and the tanks were outside that building aimed at the protesters. All right, again, in very famous video footage, which I'm sure you can search on YouTube, we see the flowers that are actually put inside the tank, but more what's the word I'm having a moment here, sorry. I don't want to say more symbolically, but the turrets of the tank turn, all the tanks that were out there turn from facing the protesters, and they turn around, and now the tank turrets are pointed at the building itself, which means, of course, that the communist leadership lost control of the military. Communism has collapsed. All right, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. And we see here in the man in the middle is Boris Yeltsin, and he's going to become Russia's first elected president. And I should add that the Soviet Union disintegrates or separates into what originally became known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, the 15 separate countries, Russia being the biggest of the former Soviet states. So then, just to sum up quickly, the Eisenhower Doctrine expands the Truman Doctrine to the Middle East. Détente was Nixon's policy of easing tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was successful, but it was temporary. All right. Ultimately, it's going to be President Reagan's large buildup of our military. All right, and the Soviets trying to copy that, which is going to lead to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union. All right, and do keep in mind the fall of the Berlin Wall marks the beginning of the collapse of communism. And that brings us to the end of the Cold War.